This is Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist at Vital Mind Psychology here in Sydney, Australia. And this is the second installment in this new series on empaths and understanding the psychology of empaths. As always, you can check me out at vitalmind.com.au, including finding out about my online coaching services wherever you are in the world, and also check me out at on Facebook. Just search for Vital Mind Psychology. So this is the second video in this new series, and really these first two videos are looking at laying down the core groundwork for what's to come in the rest of the series. So in the video last week, it was on providing a definition and a conceptual framework for understanding what is an empath. And in this video, I want to continue to look at a number of other conceptual issues which will help us better understand the internal psychological dynamics of empaths. And based on the video today, we can begin to outline in a lot more detail some of the core issues that empaths tend to face, especially in relationships with narcissistic individuals. So I'm looking at, in this video, at a model which is based on a mix of my own clinical experience in working with individuals in clinical practice, as well as concepts that are taken from various therapy traditions, including Gestalt therapy, schema therapy, and more broadly, archetypal psychology and Jungian psychology and Jungian concepts. Now, a key concept for understanding the model that I'm presenting in this video is that of self-states or modes. Now, self-states or modes are different parts of the psyche, and think of them as different aspects of the personality that can function independently of each other. These self-states are not simply different moods, because when one is in a particular self-state, one adopts the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of that states. And you can also think of these self-states as very distinctive patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that are unified by a particular theme or a particular role or purpose. So each self-state or each mode represents a distinct way in which one experiences themselves and in which one experiences the world or sees the world. Now, these self-states are not different personalities. Instead, think of them as different aspects of the one personality that are coming online at different times. And they can be adaptive or non-adaptive self-states. They can be protective or they can be harmful. Now, we get into trouble psychologically if we frequently get stuck in one particular self-state, or we have a limited number of underdeveloped self-states that we can access. And a marker of increasing psychological health is that there is a unification or an integration of these different self-states so that we do not experience very rapid or market shifts in how we experience ourselves and the world. Now, I promise a lot of what I've said is going to become a lot clearer as the series continues, and I'll be explaining the same concepts in different ways throughout the series. So if this seems like some psychobabble, it will make sense. I promise, just bear with me. So the model of the empath psyche that I'm presenting here has 4 different self-states or modes. 2 of these are overdeveloped or over-accessed, and 2 are underdeveloped or under-accessed or haven't really reached the point of maturation. And this creates an imbalance in the inner psychological landscape of the empath. And what I will do in this video is I'll briefly outline the essential features of each self-state. There are 4. And in the coming videos, I will go into a lot more detail into how these self-states operate, how they operate individually as well as dynamically with each other, and how, by understanding the interplay between the self-states, we can begin to have a more intellectually satisfying understanding of what's happening for empaths. And we can also start to look at therapeutic strategies for helping empaths with where they typically get stuck. So the four self-states are the inner child, the inner critic, the adult, and the warrior. Now, the inner child is the most vulnerable to environmental insults and into imprinting from the environment. Think of the inner child as the most malleable aspect of our psyche. Think of the inner child as almost like putty or dough. It's very easily very easily receives the imprints or the impressions from the environment. And the core needs of the inner child are to gain love and to feel a sense of security. And ideally, the inner child within all of us will gain love for just existing, for just being. But in reality, none of us grew up with perfectly emotionally attuned parents. Our inner child had to give up aspects of our true self in order to adapt and to survive. So we had to sacrifice aspects of our authentic true self in order to gain whatever love and security we could gain. And this level of adaptation occurs on a continuum. For some individuals, they had to adapt to such an extent where there is a great loss to the authentic sense of self. And this is where we get into the terrain of pathology or disorders or really dysfunctional patterns of behaving based on those early adaptations. Now, when it comes to empaths, the empath has an overdeveloped inner child self-state or mode, meaning that this self-state is overly activated in empaths and it's frequently accessed, but it lacks the support of the other two underdeveloped self-states, what I'm calling the adult and the warrior. Now, the inner child can be thought of as our most essential, pristine, and virginal nature before the imprinting of the environment has taken hold. This is the essential nature of the inner child. In certain faith traditions, in certain religious traditions, including my own, the distinguishing feature of these great human beings, these luminous beings that we call prophets, messengers, saints throughout history, is that their inner child was in fact untouched by the world. It remained pristine. It did not go through this process of having the environmental imprints and insults acting upon it, and therefore the subsequent development of these ego adaptations that the inner child has to make in order to survive and gain love. So these people in history that are called in various traditions prophets, messengers, saintly people, maintained their essential nature, which was not distorted by the lens of the ego and its adaptations to the environment. Now, the reason why I'm referencing that at this point is that the inner child in its most pristine form is the source of light, of what is luminous. If you want to use spiritual language, of what is spiritual, of what is divine, what is the essential nature of the human being. But because this is the case, it's also most vulnerable to these insults and imprinting. And as we proceed with the series, we'll get to see how the inner child of the empath developed certain adaptations based on certain themes or certain types of imprinting or environmental insults or shocks that the inner child received. Now, the inner critic is the second self-state in this model, and it too is overly accessed by the empath, or it's overrepresented in the empath's internal psychological landscape. And the inner critic, the inner child of the empath has an overdeveloped inner critic. The inner critic typically develops to support, strengthen, and crystallize the survival adaptations that the inner child had to make in order to gain whatever love and security it could gain. And the inner critic reinforces the maladaptive rules. It can be punitive, and the inner critic is the source of perfectionism, cynicism, nihilism, and extreme skepticism. And it is the inner critic self-state which gives the sense that one is never good enough, one can never measure up. Now, the inner critic operates largely on a verbal, linguistic level. And when this self-state is activated, there is a stream of negative inner dialogue. The inner critic lacks the spiritual insight and intelligence of the inner child in its most essential nature, the inner child's essential nature, and is actually very two-dimensional. It is not very sophisticated, yet it is harmful because of the ferocity with when it's activated, that it can attack the inner child. And if you want to know more about the inner critic, I've recorded a video previously on shrinking the judge or shrinking the empath's inner critics. You can take a look at that video. Now, the third self-state in this model of the empath's psyche is called the adult. And in its healthiest form, the adult self-state nests and protects the inner child, grounding it in the current objective lens of the adult self. The adult also sets limits on the inner critic, so it cannot launch these full-scale attacks on the inner child. Now, the adult self operates in real time, in the present, in the here and now, so that it can actually take in accurate data as it relates to the self and to others, data that is not distorted through the lens of the earlier adaptations and dysfunctional beliefs of the inner child that has gone through that process of imprinting. The adult self state has access to a lot more coping strategies than does the inner child alone. It's more sophisticated, it's a more psychologically mature self state that is capable of abstract thinking, of abstract reasoning, and it's also capable of taking responsibility for its actions and in accurately perceiving the internal mental states of others. In technical language, the adult is capable of mentalization. Mentalization being the ability to think in terms of mental states, to think abstractly. And the fourth self-state is that of the warrior. And the warrior self-state is an extension of the adult self-state and represents the full maturation of the adult self-state. The warrior nests and protects both the adult and the inner child. And the warrior self-state is severely underdeveloped in most empaths, or it becomes distorted after the empath has been wounded, a point I'll explain in more detail as this series progresses, and also a point that I really looked at when I did the previous video on the empath in trouble, where if you review that video, you'll also get some pointers on what I'm saying here. But again, I will be explaining this in more detail. Now, the core role of the warrior is to protect the pristine energy of the inner child so that it is not robbed, vampirized, or oppressed. This is the warrior in its fullness, in its most essential true form, its uncorrupted form. The warrior is not necessarily violent, but it is primarily protective and is triggered by injustice, whether against oneself or others. And healthy warrior energy is not tyrannical, it's self-aware, and it's measured. So in the next video, I want to explore in more detail each of these self-states. In the coming videos, I want to explore in more detail these self-states and how each of these self-states manifest in the empath, what it looks like when it's in its balanced form, and what each self-state looks like when it's in its imbalanced form. And by understanding, or by beginning to understand, the dynamic interplay between these different self-states, we can begin to make sense of many of the anomalies that empaths experience, especially as it relates to the patterns they enter into when in relationship with narcissists. So I look forward to seeing you at the next installment of this new series. I'm really looking forward to sharing these insights with you as we really provide a psychological model in which we can begin to make sense of some of these things. For example, one of the things that this model can help us make sense of is why is it that just simply learning new skills or having new insights often isn't enough for empaths to not recreate some of the same patterns over and over again in their relationships? Why is that the case? Well, if we understand these different self states and how they operate, then we can begin to have some answers to these anomalies or these conundrums. And also, a model such as this allows us to really create some openings for some therapeutic strategies and breakthroughs as we begin to see the interplay between these self states. So I look forward to seeing you at the next installment in this new series. God willing, take care. Bye-bye.